Встречайте, экс-аналитик Центрального разведывательного управления США Рэй МcGovern. Добрый вечер.
Добрый вечер.
Пойдемте. У нас вот есть такая небольшая трибуна здесь. Я знаю, что у вас есть речь, которую вы хотели сказать.
Большое спасибо. Еще раз большое спасибо. I was first here in Moscow in 1972 when the strategic arms negotiations were taking place. And we concluded the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which created the stabilizing factor for years and years of stability, ending only when George Jr. Bush decided, for reasons best known to him, to get out of the SALT treaty. There was a balance. It was the cornerstone for strategic stability. And without any real explanation, George Bush, in 2002, 30 years later, left the treaty. Now, during 1972, I was the chief of the Soviet Foreign Policy Branch in the Central Intelligence Agency, and I worked very closely with Mr. Jack Matlock, a colleague, who was the head of the Soviet desk at the State Department. And we told President Nixon and President Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, that we thought Russia was interested in arms control, not only to save a lot of money, but also to make sure that China didn't gain a march in competition with Russia. Nixon had just been in China, and we found that that made Brezhnev and Kosygin even more interested in making sure that China did not steal a march on Russia in developing good relationships with the United States. Now, in those days, we talked about a triangular relationship, okay? It was pretty much equilateral. China, Russia, the United States. Lately, in recent decades, it has become isosceles, if you remember your geometry, with the big arms being Russia and China, and the US on the short end of the stick. 2 against 1 is what it ends up with now, and that's a major sea change. What the old Soviet jargon used to say, a major change in the correlation of forces, politics or strategic or international relations 101. So what did that bring us? Well, 50 years later, when Mr. Biden came in as our president, he decided to have a summit with Mr. Putin, and they met in Geneva in June of 2021. The problem was that the adolescent advisors that Mr. Biden had, Blinken and Sullivan, hadn't really got onto the fact that Russia and China were pretty much together now, and that there was 2 against 1. And so when Biden was finished talking with Mr. Putin, and before he got on the plane, he said, "Oh, you know, I can't really tell you what I told Mr. Putin, but, Putin's got a real problem. He's got this very, very long border, thousands of kilometers with China. China's going to be a major military as well as an economic power, and China is squeezing Russia." Huh? They spent the next few years trying to pry a wedge between Russia and China, but the game was over. China and Russia, as I said, were 2 against 1. Now, I want to go into Ukraine and how this all relates to the situation in Ukraine, And I would have to say that on February 4th, 2022, we had the meeting between Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi in Beijing, and a very, very deep and large strategic relationship equivalent to a treaty was signed there, and that sort of set the stage for China supporting pretty much what Russia did in Ukraine. But I want to go back a few years and talk about what Biden experienced as vice president. Apparently, he wasn't listening very well because President Obama in 2015 said, look, we have to be really careful about identifying our strategic interests, what our core interests are. We have no core interests in Ukraine. Russia does. So we want to be careful not to get involved in the core interests of other countries. And besides that, the worst thing we could do, says Obama, is to give the Ukrainians the idea that they could prevail in a battle with a much stronger Russia right on their border. So the worst thing we could do is give them that idea. So don't give them any offensive arms. Be wise, be gentle, don't do it. Now, why Biden came in with these adolescents, Blinken and Sullivan that I mentioned before, and decided, well, they could do it, that's for the historians to decide, but they did it. Now, what we have now is a salutary development with Mr. Witkoff acting very much the way that Henry Kissinger acted under Nixon and when Nixon and Ford were president. What do I mean? I mean that negotiations are being conducted with direct reference to the president, Witkoff and Trump right now, and the bureaucracy is being shunted aside. Now, I saw that same thing in 1972 when Kissinger was doing all the work, and the people in the State Department and the people in the embassy here in Moscow were really, really angry because they didn't know what was going on. What would happen is that Kissinger would go visit, and he'd talk to Brezhnev and Kosygin and the others, and then on the way out, he'd stop in Helsinki and he'd call Ambassador Beam and said, oh, by the way, I was just in Moscow for a couple of days, and you should know this, and this is what I decided. Now, people got very angry about that because the State Department likes to know what's going on, but the ambassador, Jacob Beam, was a real professional, and he said, look, as long as the work is getting done, it's getting done. That's the big thing, okay? And don't worry about Kissinger not stopping by. He's telling us what's going on after the fact, but that's better than nothing. Why do I mention that? Well, one little comic aspect of this was that in the political section of the U.S. Embassy here in Moscow, in the old building, somebody played a joke and put a big sign up on the wall, and it said, Kissinger was here. In a playback to the old Kilroy was here during World War II. Most of you are far too young to remember that. But the joke was that Kissinger was never there, much less did he have to use the bathroom in the political section of the U.S. Embassy. Now, if we go back to the situation that Obama faced with respect to things like Syria, we realized that when the so-called neocons, the real righteous, the real crazy people in Washington wanted to make war on Syria, as they had done on Iraq, and as they had caused to happen in Libya, Obama was under great pressure to do that, to fire his Tomahawk missiles from the Mediterranean into Damascus. And by chance, he went up to St. Petersburg for a summit, a wider summit with other countries involved, but Mr. Putin met him and said, look, I have a solution to your problem. You don't want to make another war? We can help you. And Obama said, huh? What your government had done was talk to the Syrians and said, look, if you get rid of all your chemical weapons, and it's verified by the UN, we could tell Obama, this is done. You don't have to worry about making a war in Syria. That's what happened, okay? That was a major victory for common sense. And best of all, there was a reaction by Mr. Putin and Mr. Obama. Matter of fact, Mr. Putin wrote an op-ed that appeared in the New York Times on the 12th of September, right when all this was going on. And he was dealing directly with Mr. Obama. And I've been told that Mr. Putin wrote these words himself in the last paragraph of this op-ed. It's very much worth knowing about, so I'm going to read you most of the last paragraph. Mr. Putin wrote, my working and my personal relationship with President Obama is marked by growing trust. The key word, the coin of the realm, trust. Former Secretary of State Schultz, for whom I briefed every other morning for 4 years, and who was a real professional. The last thing he wrote at age 100 was the need for trust in foreign relations. So here's Obama. Growing trust. I carefully studied Obama's address to the nation on Tuesday, and I disagree with the case he made for American exceptionalism. And this is a quote. It is extremely dangerous to encourage people to see themselves as exceptional. There are big countries and small countries, rich and poor, those with long democratic traditions and those still finding their ways to democracy. We are all different. But when we ask for the Lord's blessings, we must not forget that God created us all equal. Whoa. Growing trust, and all countries are being equal, and the real danger being the notion that one country should be exceptional. Now, the growing trust in September of 2013 dissipated very quickly when Victoria Nuland and some of those hardliners set up a coup in Kiev in February of 2014. So this growing trust lasted about 6 months, okay? Now, your Foreign Minister, Lavrov, just Sunday talked about the betrayals that happened on the Maidan when Russia was promised that Yanukovych could go away, could stay, and then the election would come later. And then when the Minsk Accords were violated, all these things are documented by the people who were supposed to secure those accords, Hollande in France and Merkel in Germany. So these things are all betrayals, but still, the good news is that President Putin and Lavrov are talking again about trust. По-моему, says Mr. Putin, I think Mr. Trump is sincere. I think he wants to do a deal on Ukraine, and I think we can trust that this can be arranged. Lavrov saying, look, this is possible. It's going to happen very, very gingerly and very slowly. Actually, Foreign Minister Lavrov said some really amazing things Sunday on Face the Nation, one of CBS's largest news programs. I won't quote him at length, but he said, look, first of all, President Trump, get this, folks, President Trump is probably the only leader on earth who recognizes the need to address the root causes of the situation in Ukraine. He said it was a huge mistake to pull Ukraine into NATO. He said that this is a mistake made by the Biden administration, and he, Lavrov, and Mr. Putin want to set this straight, want to rectify this. He talked about the European Union trying to prepare military units to send to Ukraine and making other unusual efforts to get the financing for more weapons. But then he said, against this backdrop, and this is, he said this to a newspaper, it's quite encouraging that this contrasts with the Biden administration, which pumped Kiev full of lethal weapons. President Trump has said many times there would be no conflict if Biden had not sought to drag Ukraine into NATO. Lavrov continues, Moscow and Washington maintain a dialogue to find a path toward a settlement. We hope this paves the way for mutually acceptable results. Now, these are facts, folks. These are facts that are hard to insert into the media in the West. But facts are facts. Reality is reality. And the people who have been right all along about Ukraine, about Russia, what is likely to happen if the West tries to get Ukraine into NATO, well, they're worth listening to. First and foremost among them is John Mearsheimer, who is called the Dean of the Realistic School of International Relations. 12 years ago, he wrote that if the West kept trying to get Ukraine into NATO, this would result in the destruction of Ukraine, because Russia has a core interest in securing its border and making itself from the kind of threat that threatened the United States when Khrushchev tried to put offensive strike missiles in Cuba. I asked John Mearsheimer at a public meeting, John, do you think that Mr. Putin had any options other than to go in to Ukraine with the special military operation? And Mearsheimer said, no. I don't think he had any other options. I do believe, says Mearsheimer, that Putin was deeply committed to finding a negotiated settlement. He was deeply committed to the Minsk agreement because what he wanted to do was shut down the conflict in the Donbass so he would not have to invade. No, he had no other options. He offered a paper, a treaty to NATO and to the United States. Look, if you consider these conditions, we can work something out. And what happened? The West said, no, we prefer to try to weaken you. Now, you don't have to take McGovern or Mearsheimer's word for that. The head of NATO, Secretary General Stoltenberg, told the EU Parliament, look it up, September 7th, 2023, quote, Putin's precondition for not invading Ukraine was no Ukraine in NATO. We rejected that, so he went to war, proudly saying, we rejected that. Weird. That's the caliber of people you have at the top of NATO, I dare say. All those people killed because we rejected that, Stoltenberg. So back to Mearsheimer, he says, look, I think that President Putin felt he had no choice because there was no other option to deal with the problem. So I think that Russia, with great reluctance, after they had exhausted all the other options, went into Ukraine. Now, I want. Now, I have to say that with respect to when I get home, they'll say, "Oh, but that's what Lavrov says. Oh, but that's what Putin says." And I will say, "That's fact. That's history. It's in the record, okay?" And so, if people say that I'm in Mr. Putin's pocket, they just don't know what they're talking about. Now, let's get back to the present situation. We are about to experience the 80th anniversary of the Allied War. The U.S. and the Soviet Union together beat the Nazis 80 years ago. Now, I have to tell you that I'm painfully aware that 27 million Soviet citizens perished in World War II, that 400,000, by contrast, U.S. soldiers, all soldiers, perished. There are some people that I know that know this firsthand. Larry Wilkerson, a colonel, Scott Ritter, another friend of mine, both of whom belong to our group, Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, had a colloquy on this. You'll find it on my website, raymcgovern.com. The title is Russia Bore the Brunt of the Hostilities in World War II, and the U.S. came and helped with providing all manner of arms. Now, included in the 400,000 was my uncle, Larry, after whom I have my middle name. Larry was my uncle, and he had a mother, and he had a sister, my mother, and his mother was my grandmother, so I know a little bit about what I'm speaking about. And in closing, I want to quote a poet, the poet Ruskoy Skorby Nekrasov. Внимаю ужасом войны. Внимаю ужасом войны. При каждой новой жертве боя мне жаль не друга, не жены, мне жаль не самого героя. Увы, утешится жена, и друга лучший друг забудет. А где-то есть душа одна, она до гроба помнить будет. Среди лицемерных наших сел и из всякой пошлости и прозы одни я в мире посмотрел святые искренние слезы, то слезы бедных матерей. Им не забыть своих детей, погибших на кровавой ниве, как не понять плохого шаиве своих поникнувших ветвей. Thank you. Thank you very much. This is the sad part of this. I'm going to have a more joyful part before I finish. The first time I recited that poem here in Russia was at an anniversary of the meeting on the Elbe, the 25th of April, 1945. And after I recited that poem, a very tall Soviet general, General Alexander Abdamov came up. He was about 6'4", and he looked down at me. I'll never forget it. He said, Studebaker, 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 and he gave me a great big Russian bear hug, okay? Most of you are too young to understand what that is. Who knows what Studebaker was? It was a car and truck manufacturer that the United States turned completely over to making trucks and tanks and other things for sending through Iran into southern Russia so people like General Abdamov could use them to beat the Nazis, okay? The only English word that this general knew was Studebaker, but it was imprinted in his head because he was a young lieutenant at the time, and he was using these, we call them deuce and a halfs, they're 2.5-ton trucks for all manner of resupply and even rocket firing. So that's the good news. Now, may we have that picture that I ordered up here. I have a little representation of the meeting on the Elbe. There we are. Okay. Now, this is the good news. These are the people that survived, all right? Let's realize the 27 million who didn't survive, but there on the left and the right, U.S., Russian soldiers. And there's a nurse there, and the nurse is pinning or giving some flowers to a U.S. Army doctor, an Army doctor who was responsible for working not only with the Americans, but with the wounded Russians. So this was a day we celebrate, okay? 80 years ago, on April 25th, upcoming now, of course, is a celebration of the 8th and 9th, and I'm delighted that there's going to be a ceasefire. I just hope we can all rejoice, but we can all remember. We can all remember, as Nekrasov did, what pain there was. Not only that, but that we stood this together. We ended up together. There's no reason we can't be together in the future to build a better world, okay? And I want to add just one thing here, and that is, I don't think I can make any public speeches without mentioning that our country is enabling genocide in Gaza and the West Bank. I mention that because this is horrific. This happened during World War II, and nobody did anything about it. So one of my hopes is that the U.S. and Russia can now join with others and put an end to genocide and to forced starvation. I am a child of Ireland. 2 of my grandfathers escaped forced starvation. So I have a certain affinity to what happened there. So let's hope that genocide will end. And this is not quite intricately related, but it's got to happen. Большое спасибо за ваше внимание.
Рэй, спасибо огромное за ваше выступление, что сегодня здесь, на этой сцене, в российской столице. Мы, может быть, присядем, если вам будет удобно. Идемте, я вам помогу. У меня есть к вам такой вопрос. Как вы считаете, как завершатся переговоры по Украине и что в будущем ждет эту страну?
I would say that one has to be hopeful. The difference here is between Trump and Biden. And best of all, President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov have shown themselves flexible enough to recognize that this is одна большая разница, huh? A big difference. So there is hope. Now, in the U.S., there are people who are against this. There are people that the president had to choose to become part of his regime because of political interests in Congress and elsewhere. So far, he has been able to stand up to them, shunt them aside, and say, yes, Secretary of State Rubio, just like William Rogers in 1972, you can go to the opera, as Rogers did, but Kissinger's going to do the work. Witkoff now is going to do the work. And Rubio, you can go to the opera too, okay, if you want to go to Bolshoi, as happened in 72. Now, it's not all that easy. You also have Kellogg, who is selling cornflakes all over Europe. Some of you will know what the allusion there is. And also Waltz. So these people are unreconstructed neocons, and I'm a little bit surprised that the president has gone this far out on a limb, depending on Witkoff, to do what he tells him to do, and just bypassing these other people who are nothing but trouble, to include the Europeans, who are nothing but trouble. So the outcome is not certain, but for the first time, we have a reasonable nadezhda, right? We have reasonable hope that this will come out all right if we all support the sensible notion that we ought to live together in peace.
Спасибо. У нас сегодня в зале очень много молодых людей, будущее нашей страны. У них есть много вопросов к вам. Давайте несколько вопросов попросим задать наших участников встречи.
Здравствуйте. Скажите, пожалуйста, меня вот зовут Вероника, город Липецк. Я представляю областной центр культуры, народного творчества и кино. Скажите, Россия, как США, какой образ сложился у США о России?
К сожалению, there has been a media blitz to make your country and President Putin, well, in his case, out to be the devil himself or a Hitler, that kind of thing. Now, people like my friend Oliver Stone and I, and many others, are trying to tell the truth. So far, we've made an impact. We're making more and more of an impact, but it's still an uphill struggle to tell the American people, look, we could deal with the Russians. We have in the past. There's no reason. Now, I was really delighted that Oliver Stone quoted that wonderful speech of John F. Kennedy on the 10th of June, 1963. I had just joined the C.I.A. And he said there was no reason why we can't live together. As a matter of fact, he said the important thing is to avoid forcing the other country into a choice between humiliating retreat and the use of nuclear weapons, okay? So he said we have to really deal and recognize that we're all human beings and that we have an interest in making sure that nuclear war doesn't happen. And most of you know that this was only about 8 months after nuclear war almost happened over Cuba, okay? So the other thing that President Kennedy said that I think is relevant here is that among all the key countries in the world, all the important countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, Russia, have never been at war one with the other. Now, there were troubles in Murmansk and the Far East during the revolutions, Russian Revolution, but that holds. Now, If we've never been at war one with the other, let's keep it that way. And there's no reason why that should change. Thank you.
Спасибо. Еще один вопрос.
Good evening, Mr. McGovern. Меня зовут Ангелина, я ученица 11 класса, представляю город Москва. У меня есть следующий вопрос. По вашему мнению, удалось ли предотвратить Третью мировую войну, или же угроза все еще висит над нами? Спасибо.
I would say that we have managed to prevent it. During the Biden government, I was very, very afraid. I was more afraid than ever before, and I've been around for a while, that this would escalate to a nuclear exchange. I do not think that that danger is completely gone, but it's greatly less. When people are talking to each other, after all, President Biden didn't talk to President Putin, and Foreign Minister Lavrov couldn't find Tony Blinken to talk to. They didn't talk for years, unprecedented. So now they're talking. I'm more relaxed. I don't think we have to worry quite as much, but we have to be alert, not to force each other into a situation where, as Kennedy said, the choice becomes humiliating retreat or using nuclear weapons. Thank you for the question. That was a good one.
Спасибо. Спасибо. Друзья, давайте поблагодарим нашего гостя Рэй МcGovern. Спасибо, что сегодня с нами. Спасибо.
Got him. Thank you.